Hi and welcome to this, which is part 2 in this series, where I'm going to try and get this gearbox off and have a look at either the gearbox or the clutch because of that rattle noise. So as you can see, the outer bumper's off, the wheels are off, inner wheel arches are off, and the gearbox is being drained. So in this episode, which is part 2, I'm now going to concentrate on the subframe, to remove the whole subframe from under the car on a trolley jack. And as we progress, I will need to actually use a support bar on top of the engine to hold the engine when we actually remove this engine mount, which is on the gearbox. So as the gearbox comes out, the engine has to be supported somehow. I mean, you can try using a trolley jack underneath, but then it sort of gets in the way a bit. So ideally you'd use a support bar across the top, which is what I'll be doing. So in this episode 2, all my focus is on the subframe. So thank you for watching and hope you enjoy it. So before doing anything, it might be worth just having a quick look at the components of the subframe. And here I've sort of coloured them in so we can see, like, the crush tubes are in green, the control arms are in yellow, and the infamous control arm bush is there in blue, and the main part of the subframe is in red. And you can also see the drive shafts, which are in purple. So I thought I'd just do a quick heads up before the video starts where I'm actually removing the subframe, because according to the manual you should remove the drive shafts first, because obviously once the subframe's off, it's all flexible and going to go everywhere. You're never going to undo that nut unless you use an air impact. Now, I'm thinking that this should come off anyway. We should just pull the drive shafts out, and as long as they're supported, that will save you having to buy a 32mm socket, having to own a torque wrench that's able to do 182 Newton meters to redo this back up, and also you'd have to buy a new nut as well. So to me, if you're removing the subframe, it would seem more sensible to avoid messing around with all that and just use the flexibility that we've now got to actually just pull the drive shaft out and support it on straps. But the choice is yours. But that's what I'm going to do in this video, so hence why the drive shafts haven't been removed. But yeah, if you wish to undo the drive shafts, then obviously make sure you undo this nut before you remove the subframe, otherwise you're going to have a hell of a job with it moving all over the place. So I thought I'd just quickly add that bit before the video starts. Thank you. But for the moment, I'm just going to spray a little bit of plus gas around, well, if the straw stays on there, around some of these bolts, just to make things a bit easier. Bearing in mind, a lot of these nuts actually should be replaced on rebuilding. So for personal safety and fire risk, we best disconnect the battery, and we always disconnect the negative first. So the battery is on the right hand side. We just need to lift up the weather strip there, and then the plastic cover comes up, and it's the negative we need to remove first because of the danger of shorting out the positive to the body of the car. So that's a 10mm socket there, and we can safely pull the negative off without the fear of shorting anything out. Right then, I'll pop the cover back on and we can carry on. So 10mm socket here for the little bolt there that's on the crush tube that's holding the radiator module, and then here we need a 16mm socket and a pretty big breaker bar to remove the 2 bolts on either side for the crush tubes. So they are quite tight. I think those are normally tightened to 100 Newton meters, like most of the subframe. So that's the crush tube now removed. Quick look at that, and then we need to do the other side. So again, 16mm socket, pop that out. These are quite long bolts, and then finally the 10mm on the other side for the front module. And then we can just wiggle that and gradually pull it free. So that's our second one out. So at this point, it might be worth having a quick look at a photo showing the steering track rod end, because we've got to undo that, the lower ball joint on the control arm, and there's the drive shaft. And while we're at it, we might as well have a quick look at this infamous control arm bush where you can't access the top bolts. And there's a photo just to show those two bolts, and as you can see, once that subframe's up there, you can't access them. So a bit of an issue, that one, but there's the torque settings anyway. So starting with the track rod end, we need a 15mm socket. Sometimes you need the hex key. You don't normally, because it's quite tight in there. And then what I'll do is I'll pop the nut back on, so I can just give this a bit of a sharp tap to free that up. So that's the steering track rod disconnected now. Now these nuts should all be replaced as a matter of safety. So it's a 16mm socket on the anti-roll bar, and as you'll notice, it will just keep spinning around. So what you may need is a 16mm spanner, and then just pop in a 5mm hex key just to hold the centre part of the ball joint still while you undo it, like so. And then we can just pop that drop link out of the anti-roll bar. So that's two down now. So then moving on to the lower ball joint on the control arm, that's an 18mm socket. And just bear in mind, once you remove this, it would be rather difficult to remove the drive shaft nut. So I am taking a bit of a gamble here that I can pull those drive shafts out, because I'm hoping there'll be enough movement that they will be able to just pull out. But anyway, so back to this. So the idea is you hit it with a hammer and it should shake it loose and they pop off. Now I've never had much luck with that. So the method I tend to use is I jack it up with a bottle jack. Still trying to be a bit optimistic there that it may pop off, and it's not going to. So the method I use, which definitely works, is a massive breaker bar and give it a couple of whacks. 1, 2, 3. There you go. That's a lot easier. So that's the ball joint there taken off. So I'll just put the nut back on. Like I say, all these nuts should be replaced with new ones. So there is quite a lot of movement there, so I'm hoping that I might be able to just pull that and pull the drive shaft out from the gearbox, but time would tell. So onto the other side, track rod end disconnected, and then onto the anti-roll bar. So like I say, if you are worried about that, you may wish to undo those big nuts before you go too far. I mean, if I get in trouble at the end of the day, I should be able to use an air impact to get myself out of trouble. But we'll see how it goes. I'm optimistic they may just pull out. So the old breaker bar trick again. Go on, one more. No, two more. 3 more. And it's off. Does seem to work quite well, that method. So those are all nice and, should I say, floppy. Plenty of movement in that now. Okay then, so going under the car, I'm just going to loosen the engine mount with a 16mm socket. So the engine will swing once this is removed. So I'm just going to loosen it, and as you'll see, the engine, everything's moving backwards and forwards. So I'll just pop it in for the moment, because what I want to do is just loosen some of these subframe bolts. Now it's worth noting that on the power steering pump there is 2 connectors. That's the signal connector, and there's a power one which is behind it, which I found very difficult to get to. So I'll try and remove that when I lower the subframe. So I'll just leave that one for the moment. So before lowering the subframe, we need to drain and free the power steering reservoir bottle, as it will be coming down with the subframe. So what I'll do is I use this rather handy syringe, and we can suck this power steering fluid out of the reservoir, because as this subframe comes down, this bottle will be all sort of falling over the place, so there is a risk of the fluid coming out. So just to be safe, we'll suck this out and pop it into a container for safekeeping. Yeah, it takes about 2 of those. There you go, it's all out. Just don't knock it over your engine. So what we will then need to do is disconnect these 3 nuts. So that's a 10mm socket, probably a deep socket for this one here. So that just holds the reservoir clamp, and then we've got the 2 at the back with a couple of big washers. So that's like on a rubber suspension sort of affair. So the bracket just comes off then, and we can just try and spring the clamp open and remove that. So that reservoir will be dropping downwards as the subframe comes out. So what you do need to do is just make sure the heat shield is bent back slightly for that. So we need to disconnect the exhaust oxygen sensor cable that's clipped to the power steering pipes. So I'll show a quick photo there to show that plastic clip that's attached to it. So I found it a little bit easier if I just undid the HT leads for the smart plugs and the power cable to the coil pack. Just gave you a bit more space to get your hand down there and unclip that sensor wire. Right then, so now to disconnect the steering wheel column from the steering rack via the universal joint. Please note that these bolts should be replaced. So here's a photo showing that universal joint eccentric pinch bolt, which must actually be replaced on renewal. So it's just tucked down there. I'm just going to spray that with a little bit of penetrating fluid to make taking the nut off easier. So it's a 13mm socket, and it is quite deep down there. So what you don't want to do though is move your steering wheel around too much and get it out of sync with where it should be in the straight ahead position, because as you're doing this it can move around because you're trying to get access to that nut. So you do want to make sure that it's all aligned again. So I'm just going to check that now by putting the track rod's ends back in, making sure it's all in the straight ahead position, which it is. Right, so I'm just going to mark it as well, but let's just pull the bolt out so you can actually see what it looks like. It's quite a strange looking bolt. So as you can see, so it's a bolt that can't turn once it's in there. So like I say, I'm just going to mark that because I do like to mark everything. So just so that I know if the pinion moves at all. It shouldn't do, but just helps with my paranoia. And then we can just tap that back off like so. So that's free. Definitely don't want to drop the subframe with that attached. And then we've got a couple of ABS sensor wires on each side, which we need to pop off like so. So the subframe is now basically clear of all the items. So I'm now just going to start loosening the subframe bolts. I'm not dropping things just yet, as I still have that cable connected to the power steering pump. You should use a jack at all times to support the subframe. So what I'm going to do is just pop a jack under the subframe, just so that it can't drop as you start to loosen some of these bolts. Now for me, I'm obviously not going to have the jack there because I need to get access for the camera. So 16mm socket for those infamous rear control arm bushes. And these bolts actually should be replaced with new ones because I believe they're stretch bolts. And then on the other side, so I'm just getting them loose. I'm going to pop them back in because I just want to know that they're all loose and free to come out, and I'm not going to have one that's going to give me a problem. So once I know that they're all free to come out, like so, it's going to make it a lot easier just to get my jack ready and then pop the rest of the bolts out by hand. Not forgetting that power steering cable. So we just do the other side now.
Ooh, that was loud.
Yeah, see, some of them are extremely tight. So it's just a good little precaution just to make sure these are actually free and aren't going to give you any trouble on the final drop. So we've got the two that are tucked up in the wheel arches. So you may need a long extension bar for these. So you can just see it in there. So as you start undoing, the frame will start to move down. So it is quite dangerous to be underneath this while you're undoing the bolts. So, which is why it's not really a good idea. Get that one loose. I think that's probably the last one. Right then. So now the final lowering of the subframe. Okay then, so now the big task of dropping that subframe. So I'm going to highlight the bolts as I remove them so you can actually see, because they are different and some of them are slightly different. It's like this one here has a big washer on it for the bush bolt. So as you can see, I've highlighted that red. And then when we come to the one in the wheel arch, you'll notice that that is considerably longer. So again, I've marked that in red. Make sure it doesn't drop in your face. So just showing you there, that's a bit longer. So we can now come round to the other side. So I'm going to do the wheel arch one again. Do that first. So we've then just got that engine steady mount bolt to remove. So the engine's going to start moving around now. So it's just hanging there on the two mounts in the engine bay. And then we've got the three bolts for the rear pad, as it were. And then finally the bush bolt, which, like I say, technically needs to be replaced because it's a stretch bolt. Right then, so now it's a case of starting to lower the subframe, and what you need to do is obviously keep an eye on that reservoir bottle in the engine bay. So we've got the cables there underneath as well, so I'm just checking that bottle's free to drop down and it's not going to pull something with it. So yeah, we've got the cables there, they're starting to get tight now. But they're also clipped in as well. So you do need to sort of pull them out of the plastic clips. Might need a little tool there just to pop that out. And then obviously you've got the power cable. You definitely don't want to lower the subframe with that connected. Could end up meaning you need a new power steering pump motor, which would be considerable cost. So definitely don't forget about that one. Okay, so it should be now totally free to drop down. So here it comes. Just checking that reservoir bottle again. Definitely don't want to break anything. I mean, this job would be a lot easier with two people really, because you could have somebody just keeping an eye on things in the engine bay while the other person's lowering the jack. So you do want some good jack control here. So you can just drop it down nice and slowly. So you can see the reservoir bottles there on the two pipes still up in the engine bay. So that bottle's going to be tipped over as we start to bring the subframe out, which is why it's better for it to be empty. And here's the subframe. So it does give me a chance to actually clean the subframe and just check everything. Have a look at those rear bushes because they're obviously now accessible, so I could actually change the bushes and things like that while the subframe's out. Right, so I'm going to take this outside now, give it a little spray over with some gunk. You may want to cover the connections for the power steering motor because you obviously don't want to get any water in there. And then what I use is some hot water in a pressurised container, and that just gets the oil and dirt off quite nicely. It does work quite a treat, that. Sort of a budget man's pressure washer. So at least it's clean. Still looks a bit rusty, but maybe I could always paint it next year or something. So we can take a fresh look at this now that it's all been cleaned and dried. And there we can clearly see those two rear bushes there and the steering rack in the middle. And then as we come towards the front right of the car, we can see the control arm there, and there's that rear bush, and then there's the power steering motor and the engine steady mount there on the centre left, and there's the inner ball joints for the control arms, and there's the other inner ball joint just appearing now on the right hand side. So that brings us to the end of this episode, and we nicely have the subframe out of the car. But there's still plenty more to do. We've still got these drive axles to take off. We've got the battery and the housing to come out, the air filter housing to come off, the clutch slave cylinder, the gear change cables, the starter motor, and obviously this gearbox mounting where we're going to have to put the bar across the top to support the engine. So lots more to do yet in the next episode or two, but hopefully you've enjoyed, and thank you for watching. So I'll just finish off now with some reference photographs. So here is the subframe as it came off the car, complete with straw and mud. So I think my Mini did a bit of off-roading by the look of it, and also some of that subframe was actually bent. So here's the bolt layout as I took it off the car, and here's all your bolts and your torque settings for the subframe. And then if we go on to the inner ball joints, and you can see the rear control arm bush there, and those are all the torque settings for that. So back on to some photographs of the subframe, and here you can just see all the different parts of it with quite a bit of detail. It looks a little bit better now for having a clean up, and I think most of that rust is thankfully surface, but it probably could do with a bit of a strip and a repaint. Probably wouldn't hurt. But there we are, so that's the subframe, and you've been watching Dropping the Subframe for Gearbox Removal, and thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you remove your gearbox or clutch on your car. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage,
in October 2021, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook as Coats and Gators.